Hello and welcome to Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast. I'm your co-host, José Luis Granados Ceja, a Mexican-born journalist living and working here in Mexico City, as well as staff writer at Venezuela Analysis and host of the podcast over at Venezuela Analysis. And as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Kurt Hackbarth. Kurt, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, José Luis. My name is Kurt Hackbarth, writing on Mexico and Latin America for Jacobin Magazine in the U.S. and Sentido Común here in Mexico. Ready for another episode of Soberanía.
Excellent. And as always, we're bringing you news and analysis from the past week around Mexican politics, focusing obviously on the election right now. But we have something a little bit different. We're going to start the program talking about a very curious case of who watches the watchman, is the way that I've been kind of putting it, which is that the very lauded, celebrated NGO here in Mexico, Mexicanos Contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, or Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity, has been caught up in a corruption scandal of its own. And before we begin, I do want to give a warning for content, because this story does involve talk of death by suicide. So for folks who are maybe sensitive around that subject, I'll give you a heads up that we will be talking about suicide in this segment of the program. But I want to hand it over to you, Kurt. Let us know what's going on here. How's it possible? Mexicanos Contra la Corrupción are corrupt themselves, it looks like? Wow, color me shocked.
Yes. How could this possibly be, José Luis? As you've pointed out, right, Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity has its own corruption scandal. So here's the story here. As has come out over the past week, and it's not, a news story, but it has come up again because it came out in the Mañanera. The current head of this NGO, Mexicanos Contra la Corrupción y la Impunidad, María Amparo Cásar, turns out she fiddled with some official documents in order to get a pension, a lifetime pension, from the state oil company Pemex. Now, if you want to put up on the screen there, the interesting thing about this scandal is that it's not just a Mexico scandal. Because who has been one of the main funders of this NGO ever since its inception? That's right, USAID. So I wrote to the head of USAID, Samantha Power, on Twitter, saying, looks like the head of your anti-corruption front organization in Mexico is in fact corrupt herself. When you're done turning a blind eye to the genocide in Gaza, remember Samantha Power is a genocide expert, that's her academic specialty, might you want to not turn a blind eye to this? So let's get into some of the details, because it's pretty damning. Back in 2004, this is when María Amparo Cásar was part of the Fox government. She was a government official. She was the coordinator of asesores, or advisors, for the Secretario de Gobernación at the time, Santiago Creel. At that time, her husband had very recently entered into Pemex, just 4 months prior, in very tragic circumstances and in somewhat strange circumstances. He took his own life, jumping from a window of the Pemex tower. Right. This was in October of 2004. Right. Mere days after this happened, María Amparo Cásar was there trying to get his widow's benefits, getting his pension, right? Which she wasn't entitled to, actually, because he committed a suicide. And according to the rules of Pemex, if it's a suicide, you're not entitled to the pension.
As well as the life insurance policy makes it clear that if it's death by suicide, then they don't qualify. But she was very quick to do the bureaucratic mechanisms necessary to go ahead and charge that. And it's not a small sum. We're talking about 100,000 pesos a month. That is a huge pension.
20 years ago. Back 20 years ago.
Yeah, when it was worth even more. So absolutely. Yeah. It's quite extraordinary, too, the fact that you can work somewhere for 4 months, putting aside the fact that there were questionable circumstances around his death, that you can actually charge or collect a pension of that size after only being there not even half of a year. It's quite extraordinary story.
And as anyone who's lived in Mexico will know, the bureaucratic tramites take their time. Not in this case. Pemex started paying out the same month. The same month, right? This 125,000 peso a month pension, and it doesn't end there. María Amparo Cásar also got Pemex, in addition to the life insurance policy that José Luis mentioned, also has charged Pemex for gas, for food, the canasta básica, and for college degrees in private colleges for 2 of her children. Nice cash cow there at Pemex.
Absolutely.
So now Pemex is suing to try to get some of that money back.
Now, we should be clear, right? Like, you know, you might say, oh, well, why is this of public interest? Well, Pemex is a state-owned oil company, and here in Mexico we refer to as a paraestatal, which is to say the money that it generates through oil exploration, refinement, et cetera, whatever, is the property belongs to the Mexican people. So we're talking about public funds here. We're talking about a state-owned entity transferring millions of pesos. I think the estimate is around over 30 million pesos.
Actually, of 47 million pesos if you combine the pension with the life insurance policy.
Exactly.
Which is almost $3 million in today's money. You know, more than, right?
Yeah, and we should talk about the fact that this has often been referred to as a continuous case of corruption, because it's one thing to engage in questionable actions to enrich yourself via illicit means in a moment. It's another thing to do what's happening in this case, which is to collect a pension. In fact, she was collecting this pension, again, around 100,000 pesos a month, up until February of this year, 2024.
Of this year.
Until
That's right.
Pemex, the auditors, figured out, wait a minute, something here is not adding up. This person is collecting a pension when they shouldn't be because the circumstances of his death don't actually facilitate or allow for this pension to actually be distributed to his widow.
And what's interesting about this case is, you know, this came out years ago. I think there was a Proceso article about it. I've actually tweeted about it in the past. But it came up again in AMLO's new book, Gracias, which came out a couple of months ago, precisely because María Amparo Cásar approached the Attorney General of Mexico City, then governed by Mayor AMLO, and basically asked for their complicity in falsifying the documents. Because if the official death notice was suicide, this doesn't go forward, right? They didn't go along with it, so, you know, she did her end run around Pemex, right? And so, you know, this is how the story comes back up. And here's the other angle to this story, which is important, right? María Amparo Cásar isn't just, you know, a former member of the Fox government, right? She is someone who has railed against corruption in Mexico from her very hypocritical perch as head of this front organization for US aid. You know, she's railed against corruption in Petrobras, which is, you know, Brazil's version of Pemex. She's railed against corruption here in Pemex. And she's also railed against AMLO's social programs, which she calls dádivas, or handouts, or giveaways, right? And, you know, this is what I was thinking about the other day, right? You know, my mother-in-law here in Oaxaca makes 7,000 pesos a month as a tailor. You know? No pension because, you know, she was a mother raising 4 kids before that, and she's always worked for herself. Now she has, you know, the public pension of 3,000 pesos a month, right? This is very typical for Oaxaca, these kinds of salaries. 7,000 pesos a month, people make less, right? Here's María Amparo Cásar, pocketing 125,000 pesos a month, plus, you know, charging for gas and food, plus her children's tuition, right? She also charges, you know, for Channel 11. She's in the public television station, Channel 11, right? CIDE, a public university, if I'm not mistaken. In other words, you know, she's taken from various of the government, you know, teats here, right? Pemex, public university, a public television station, plus her own articles. You know, they kind of estimate she's been making like $1.5 million pesos a month, all told.
Oh my gosh.
A large part of that from government public sources. And she has the gall to write what we see on the screen here, right? In this government, there has not been a social policy understood to widen opportunities for, earning a living and leaving behind a situation of dependence on the handouts of the government, right? These handouts only alleviate poverty momentarily, but they don't, create a possibility for them to get out of it. Maybe the old clientelistic policies, which were, precisely that, designed to maintain a political structure. But this is María Amparo Cásar, who, from a privileged position in Channel 11, as a columnist, right, is calling what, my mother-in-law gets would be a handout, while she knowingly committed fraud to collect this massive pension quickly, right, in the same month as the tragedy occurred.
Yeah.
With no apparent, sense of, irony or hypocrisy. And all of this is funded, those of you who are watching this podcast in the U.S., this is funded by your tax dollars. Because U.S. aid funds generously Mexicans against corruption and impunity. In fact, the former head, before María Amparo Cásar, which is Claudio X González, is effectively the opposition leader in this country, the power behind the throne. He's doing it very poorly, which is fine, so he should keep doing it. He's the opposition leader in this country, really.
Yeah.
And the New York Times, published a big front page splash on him in 2017. Because the then New York Times correspondent, Assam Ahmed, was a big buddy with somebody over there at MCCI.
Yeah.
So the whole American superstructure up there is enthralled to these kind of organizations, which are front organizations, which use American tax dollars to intervene directly in Mexican politics. So that's why this is newsworthy, that the head of that organization turns out to be spectacularly corrupt.
Yeah. And intervenes, in promoting this right-wing ideology. We have to be clear about this because there's been this effort to try to portray MCCI, Claudio X González, as these kind of small L liberal advocates who are, political analysts, or just opining, right? No. María Amparo Cásar was a member of Fox's government, not in the cabinet, but very senior post. She is very much espousing right-wing ideology in her ideas and trying to defend that, obviously intervening in favor of the opposition that is critical of the, social programs of the López Obrador government, to universal social programs, right? I think it's important to really highlight that distinction because I think sometimes it's lost, and I always get really frustrated when people pretend like this isn't a left-wing government, right? It's advocating for universal social program. It's advocating for a rights-based understanding of social programs in a welfare state, and they are very much against that, right? They're cut from the cloth of neoliberal ideology. And it's been interesting to see the way that she's been trying to defend herself. It reminds me a lot of what happened with that New York Times story, which was full of innuendo, and we've analyzed it previously on this program. But the focus, everybody wanted to talk about, I can't believe it, López Obrador, he published her business line publicly. I mean, it was already publicly available. She changed her number the very same day, but that was what they tried to make the conversation about. And likewise, in this one, they're trying to make it like López Obrador violated her privacy by publishing this information. How dare he, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, it is actually arguable whether or not it is illegal or not, because the Transparency Institute in Mexico has explicitly said that when it's about corruption, there actually isn't protections. That it's not something that can be hidden away. We're talking about somebody who's receiving public money from a public institution, Pemex in this instance. But also, I think her defense is very cynical in the sense that she's trying to make herself the victim, but also trying to play dumb. Now,
she didn't know.
She didn't know. She's like, I had no idea that this conclusion had been reached, that it was death by suicide. That's not true. That is a bald-faced lie. We're talking about a woman who's highly educated, who's had a senior post in government, who occupies a senior post in these AstroTurf organizations and MCCI. And in fact, you just have to look at history. You just have to go back. This is the benefit of having archived news. And Nancy
Yeah.
Flores from Contralinea, who's done an incredible job covering this, must give credit where credit is due, has been really following this case, dug up this story here, which is a story from El Universal at the time that talked about what actually happened, what were the circumstances around the death of this individual, her ex-husband. And it turns out that this story, which was published, if I'm not mistaken, let me just pull it up here as it loads, like I said, around the time, October 15th, 2004, makes it
A week
very
after
clear.
it happened, mere days after it occurred.
Days after. And it was a big scandal at the time, right? The Pemex offices are here in Mexico City. It's on this street, the major street's called Marina Nacional. It was shut down for several days. In fact, it was a big scandal. It drew a lot of attention. And if you look at the story at the time, it was very obvious that there were many, many, many signs that this was a suicide. The windows don't really allow for humans to go through. Somebody would have had to make the decision to go through. Apparently, he was found with all kinds of accounts in his hand, the numbers of bank accounts. María Amparo Cásar's name was on that document that he was holding when his body was found. So all that to say that you're not going to try to pull a fast one on us. We're talking about a well-educated woman with a close, intimate relationship with this individual. You think they didn't tell her at some point, hey, this was a suicide? Of course not. But she's going around saying, "Oh, I didn't know. I understood it was always. This is really painful. I'm so sad." It's all a show, and it's a show because they've been caught red-handed. And I think, in a lot of ways, this is going to have reverberations in this election because
Absolutely.
López Obrador, as we know, was elected on a ticket that was pledged to address the rampant corruption. I think he's gone quite far, but not far enough. I think there's a lot of people who probably should be in jail that aren't. He says, I'm not a person who's interested in vengeance, but I do think that justice needs to be done. Nonetheless, it's one of the weaknesses of the re-election campaign for Morena, which is like, did they do enough for corruption? And I think this one goes to show just how things worked before, right? Like just sucking everything you possibly could through illicit means out of the state that you can, and then going around and pontificating about how corruption is bad for the country when it turns out you're just as guilty. I think this is going to have reverberations among that population that is still unsure of their vote. It's a small segment, but nonetheless, may think that, we're maybe considering voting for Mañez, maybe was considering voting for Galvez. Now, this close association of the Galvez campaign with Claudia X González, with these kinds of organizations like Mexicanos Contra la Corrupción, means that they're stained by it. They are now manchados as a result of this scandal coming to light.
Absolutely. And, what it does is, again, it crystallizes the ancien regime in Mexico, right? And all of its, all of its stench there.
Yeah.
And if you look on the screen here, and I'll read it out for those of us who are listening in audio, right? Leo Suterman, who is, a right-wing pundit here in Mexico, and he has an evening talk show, right, on Televisa called L'Hora de Opinar, right? He just wrote an article going after AMLO and the head of Pemex for daring to bring this up, right? Saying that their actions on Friday and Monday when the story came out in the morning press conference is reason alone to not vote for Morena. Current governments have to go in order to reestablish the health of the republic. Talk about grandiloquence, right? Reestablish the health of the republic. And so I retweeted this simply saying, by reestablishing the health of the republic, read or insert instead, be able to commit spectacular fraud against the public, against public finances without being bothered in the least. And this is the problem when you have, the entire cast of elite pseudo-journalists defending this.
Yeah.
Con capa y espada, as we say in Spanish, right? With the cape and the sword, right? As we say in Oresti, saying, okay, well, maybe there was a mistake in there, but you shouldn't have to go after her just because of that. Like, a 20-year fraudulent pension is a mistake for these people, right? A 20-year fraudulent pension. Ciro Gomez Leiva going crazy, Suterman going crazy, because this is how things rolled back in the old days.
What's that old Carlin joke? It's a big club, and you
And you're
ain't
not
in
in
it.
it. Yeah. And any hungry person who robs a sandwich from an OXXO is going to go to jail.
Yep.
Now, I'm not trying to be Les Mis about this. I'm not trying to be too Jean Valjean about this. But, you know, anybody who robs anything from a convenience store in Mexico is going straight to the bote. And if you don't have money for pension, for a bail or whatever else, you're probably going to be there for a while before it gets all straightened out.
Yep.
But if you doctor official documents to get a massive pension and you charge it for 20 years, you're untouchable.
Yeah.
You're untouchable, right? And that's what stinks to high heaven here about this case, right?
And I hope
This
there's
overweening sense of entitlement, and then I'll go and pontificate against social programs on my platforms given to me also by the government.
Yeah, and we'll see how they proceed. But as far as I understand, Pemex is actually proceeding with criminally. That they're not. It's not just an administrative error, or it's a criminal case now. At this point, it's been taken
That's
to
right.
the Fiscalía.
María Amparo Cásar was down in her cups about that yesterday.
Yeah. I mean, I think she thought she would maybe just pay back. It's extraordinary to think that somebody has the resources to pay back 40-something million pesos. My gosh. But I think there will be sanctions, but there are political consequences. And that's something I wanted to talk about because this is obviously connected to the presidential campaign. And, you know, I wanted to put this up on the screen here. It's just this this hilarious video. There's not, you know, I'm going to leave the audio out of it because, you know, it's not necessary. I'm not going to bother explaining. But basically, during a campaign event, Xochitl Gálvez talks about how, and you'll forgive me for the swear word here in Spanish, but es una chinga espantosa, or it is a frightening, exhaustive exercise. She's clearly not having a good time. I think it's difficult to run on behalf of the old regime. I think it's difficult to go out there every day and have to defend people that are like Alito Moreno and Marco Cortés, the party leadership that is backing her candidacy, you know, to go out there every day. A presidential campaign is hard. It's a long hours. It's a lot of flying and driving and public speaking, et cetera, et cetera. She's having a really bad time. And I think also part of it is because it's not fun to be losing. And so that's why we see Suterman say things like, this is reason alone for us to not vote for Morena, right? This is as an attempt to intervene as a result of the fact that the fortunes of the opposition are just not very bright right now. But I think something very interesting has also happened as a result of kind of all of this poor management of the campaign, the poor performance of Xochitl Gálvez, the fact that they seem to be losing support as opposed to gaining, which is there is now, you know, el momento where the masks are off. So, as a result, I think, of the fact that they are not having the resonance that they thought that they would with the public, they are not increasing their support amongst the public, polls remain the same, et cetera, we see this deliberate effort to tie the so-called pink wave, which not to be confused with the pink wave of progressive governments in Latin America, that is the name that was adopted of the so-called defenders of democracy here in Mexico, which was led by none other than Claudio X González, who's been pushing this narrative that Morena and López Obrador and a future Claudia government represents a regression, authoritarianism, et cetera, and they've been going out there and they held at this point 3 big pink demonstrations adopting the color of the INE, which is actually not allowed, but apparently continues to happen, saying that
They've
we
adopted
are
the actual logo of the INE, the Galvez campaign at one point, right?
Yeah. And we said at the time, this pink wave is just another effort to mask opposition mobilization. And I talked about it a lot when it first came about. I think it was a way for the opposition to try to actually get people to check out to the streets, and it worked. People did successfully mobilize. They did have a sizable demonstration here in Mexico City and many other cities throughout the country on this pretense that they're defending democracy, that they're defending Mexico's institutions. And they stressed this. The first one was apolitical. In fact, the only speaker was the former head of Mexico's Electoral Institute. The second one was a little bit more obvious. You had people like Beatriz Pajes and the like actually addressing the demonstration, kind of now wearing away at this notion that it's a nonpartisan initiative. The third one was openly political, openly in favor of the opposition. But at this point, this is now a new line has been crossed. So on May 19th, in the Zócalo, they're going to have a campaign rally. Because who's going to speak there?
2 weeks before Election Day. 2 weeks before Election Day.
Xochitl Gálvez and Santiago Taboada. So the candidate for the presidency on behalf of the opposition and the candidate for the governor of Mexico City on behalf of the opposition. It could not be more clear. And we have this tweet here from Carlos Pérez Ricard, who I recommend people can read as well. I think he's a great analyst. He says, many people thought that the marches in defense of the Electoral Institute were really nonpartisan. Today, their organizers put the last piece of the puzzle that was always part of the strategy, the stealing without impunity of the colors of the so-called referee in this race. This is not how you take care of institutions. This is how you pervert them. And so we can see it was never about defending democracy. It was never about the so-called authoritarian threat. It was always about shoring up support for the old regime and its representatives. And how many journalists fell for it? Hook, line, and sinker. They repeated it incessantly, trying to convince their audiences that this was actually a movement for democracy. It's the same thing as Mexicanos Contra la Corrupción. It's not an institution or an organization that is interested in actually combating corruption. It is advancing a political agenda by being funded by USAID, which we know its legacy, particularly in Latin America, of promoting regime change. And yet, these journalists, either because of their own lack of knowledge about what's happening in this country or a deliberate effort to misinform their readers, their audiences.
Willfully or cynically, right?
Went on and put forward this lie, that this is a nonpartisan thing, when it was clear to everybody. And I'm so glad this happened, because it proved us right. I told you so. Please pay attention when we talk about this, because if you're just a little bit familiar, if you're just a little bit more honest, you will see this as plain as day, as we did a few years ago when this first started to really make waves here in Mexico.
And amongst the journalists who were really, pseudo-journalists who were really peddling this story, were a number of the high flyers from the U.S.
Yep.
Right? One of the most grotesque examples was Ann Applebaum from the Atlantic, right, who wings down here, goes to Lorenzo Cordova's office, the former head of the INE, and said, wow, Lorenzo Cordova has a lot of books in his office. Lots of books. Okay. Then she goes to one of these rallies with Denise Dresser, right, the galaxy's worst pundit, right, and is totally taken in by this idea that these, plucky people out there, these plucky whitesicans from Polanco, wearing pink and lathering themselves with suntan lotion in order to not get burnt before
and
going off.
Expensive Panama hats, don't forget.
Their Panama hats were in truth, legendary democracy defenders. And you have to really have a real willful ignorance to be taken in by that, but, enough of them did, right? And, people did, and turned out, I think, amongst the public in good faith, believing that, that this really was in favor of democracy. You'd think journalists should know better, right? And then Applebaum goes back to the Atlantic and says, democracy's echoing the David Frumland, democracy's in peril in Mexico, but thank God we've got those plucky people out there defending it for everyone, right? And it turns out they were just spectacularly wrong. Again, 2 weeks before the election, another one of these pink rallies with the major presidential candidate and the major candidate for the CDMX, right? Funny that the poster still doesn't show the logos of the PRI and the PAN. They're just avoiding that as much as they possibly can into the bitter end. But they are the candidates, so, can't hide that anymore.
Yeah, and this is a politically engaged country, right? Mexicans are in tune. In fact, I actually, after the first debate, I said, I'm worried that people are going to start tuning out because it was poorly done. In fact, I think there was actually an increase in viewership for the second debate.
Was there?
So
wow.
there is an engagement here. You can't pull a fast one on the public like this. You can leave out the logos if you want, but you're not fooling anybody. This is a PRI and a PAN rally. And fine, people can go. Absolutely. Go, please. Right? That's part of having a healthy democracy, an authentic democracy, not this fake democracy that, the elites try to sell us. But I think the fact that it's happening speaks to just how bad things are going for the opposition, right? And I think there's a couple of more pieces of evidence that suggest that things are not looking good, and they're aware of it, right?
And just very briefly before you move on to your very good tweet there, in other circumstances, this is how color revolutions begin.
Right.
This is exactly how color revolutions begin. Right?
Yeah, in fact,
AstroTurf organizations, a fake civil society movement, creating this idea that democracy is in peril, U.S. funding, fortunately it's not happening here because, the Mexican public is mucha pieza, as AMLO says, but all the ingredients are there for it. It's the same recipe.
Yeah, and our friend of the show here, Doctora Violeta Vázquez Rojas, actually just published on Monday an excellent column speaking about the fact that, there is a deliberate strategy behind Xochitl Gálvez insisting on calling Claudia Sheinbaum a liar, mentirosa, right? What they're trying to do is, again, kind of lay the foundation for undermining her when she is quite likely going to win. So her future government is now kind of questioned as a dishonest and always kind of led by someone who is a liar and all this kind of stuff. It obeys that same logic, that color revolution logic. But what I wanted to talk about here was, this hilarious column from May 6th from Leon Krause, who's a Nepo baby. I love that term, right? Leon Krause has no real credit to speak of in terms of his own. He is where he is because of who his father is, right? But anyway, he publishes this column kind of talking about Álvarez Mañez, who's the third-party candidate. He's actually polling a little bit better. He's still below 10%, but he's doing much better. He's performed very well in the debates. He's attracting more attention. The more the public gets to know him, the more I think voters are interested in voting for him. About how Álvarez Mañez has a date with history. Because
again, the grandiloquence, right? They love these grandiloquence, right? Reestablish the health of the republic. Right?
Yes, and arguing that because there was a deliberate campaign to try to get Álvarez Mañez to step down, to throw his support behind Xochitl Gálvez to again save the republic, and he obviously has refused to do so. To his credit, and to the credit of Movimiento Ciudadano, despite the fact that I have many criticisms of that party and the way that it postures as progressive but isn't. I'm glad that they're maintaining an independence, and I think it's a smarter move to not associate yourself with the old regime so directly. But anyway, Álvarez Mañez is not going to step down. It doesn't look like there's any interest in that. And so there's this pressure to try to get him to, and he explicitly said, no, I'm not going to. And so, you see these kind of columns where they talk in these grandiose terms. And I think, for example, this one, I think, speaks to the fact that they must be worried. I mean, even if he did, like I mentioned here, it actually wouldn't change anything, right? Like, Claudia is polling between 55 and 60, 65%. So even if you combined all of those votes, it's not enough to win. But again, it speaks to just how bad things are. But I did want to mention this because I know many people who watch us are from the United States. And so those of you in the US will remember the 2000 election. It was the first election I paid a lot of attention to. I was a kid. I was 14, 15 years old. And I remember staying up really late at night, despite having school the next day, watching the results come in. Was Bush going to win? Was Gore going to win? And ultimately, we know what happened. George W. Bush is elected as a result of the intervention of the Supreme Court, which refused to allow for a recount in Florida. And ultimately, he's able to essentially steal the election. But anyway, he includes commentary about the 2000 election, actually referring to Ralph Nader, who ran for the Green Party. And part of the narrative was like, if he hadn't run, if he hadn't stolen votes from Gore, then all of those swing states would have gone to Gore and Bush would have never been president. Imagine how different history would have been. What would have been Gore's reaction to the September 11th terrorist attack on the World Trade Center in New York City, et cetera, et cetera. It's just, again, these grandiose things like, oh, if this alternate history, if only Ralph Nader hadn't won. But I think it's really, really deceptive. And I think it's worth commenting on because it shows just how out of touch they are. They think that, for example, in this case, that those votes that went to Nader belonged to Gore. I think most of those people might have very well have stayed home. Likewise, here, they think that those votes that are going to Álvarez Mañez would automatically be transferred to Xochitl Gálvez. It's a wrong analysis. It's a very superficial analysis. It's a lack of understanding of what compels somebody to actually take time in their day to go to the ballot box and go and vote. And so it just kind of shows that this voice, Krause, who is on television screens throughout the United States, on the private television channel there, the Spanish language channel, just they're out of touch. They don't understand. They'll give you these false analogies in an effort to try to convince you that they are the arbiters of what is, the correct path for the country, this date with history.
And thank God Mexico has the political system it does, that it's not a closed two-party system like the US, that it has public financing, and so that smaller parties can exist in the Mexican political ecosystem. Now, that's often, problematic because a bunch of these small parties are basically owned and controlled by, individual families, like the so-called Green Party and the Workers' Party, et cetera, right? But better that, that has to be reformed, but better that than to have a system like the U.S., totally privately funded, where other parties can't come in at all, and then you can even more easily, play the guilt game.
Yeah.
Right.
And so while we're on the topic of this bilateral relationship, we're going to switch on to our next topic of the program, which is this incredible story here that I thought was actually going to get more attention. It seemed like it made news, when the indictment was released. But this
the Mexican media is ignoring this one.
Yeah.
The corporate media is ignoring this one, across the board.
Yeah, a handful of coverage here, and likewise in the United States, it kind of made some noise and then kind of went away. Because what is the story here? Well, I'll read you the headline from Reuters. U.S. lawmaker Cuellar hit with bribery charges tied to Azerbaijan, the country, and a Mexican bank known as Banco Azteca. Imagine that. Banco Azteca that we've talked about so many times on this program. The bank owned by Ricardo Salinas Pliego, the kind of libertarian, right-wing, fanatic, hardcore opponent of the government, et cetera, et cetera. Who is Henry Cuellar? Well, he's mostly known today as one of the last remaining Democrats who was against reproductive rights and, in fact, faced a very competitive primary against a progressive young Latina woman and actually had Nancy Pelosi intervene directly to save him in that primary race to make sure that he could be elected. For what? Well, I guess so he could continue with his nefarious activities. I'll read you the lead here. US Representative Henry Cuellar and his wife were indicted for allegedly accepting close to $600,000 in bribes in two schemes meant to benefit an Azerbaijani state-owned energy company and an unnamed bank based in Mexico, court papers show. We know what bank that is now. It's Banco Azteca. The federal indictment returned by a grand jury in Texas on Tuesday and unsealed on Friday said that the bribes were laundered through sham consulting contracts into shell companies owned by Imelda Cuellar, the Democratic consul's wife, from December 2014 through at least November 2021. So that's the story there. Why do we bring it up here? Well, the bilateral connection, but also obviously this issue around the connection to corruption with a Mexican bank.
Yeah. I've talked about before in Jacobin and other forum about how the Mexican and the U.S. elites coordinate through, think tanks like the Baker Institute, supposedly nonpartisan academic institutions, in order to, coordinate messaging, get, their speakers into prominent places in the media, to create bogus reports like the Mexico report from the Baker Institute that allege that Marina and the narco are going to be in cahoots, that then the media laps up just to, pull something off the shelf. We've talked a lot about that. This is another example of cross-border elite coordination, right? If this is proven to be true, basically Salinas Pliego, or his former head there, Luis Niño de Rivera, were asking for Cuellar's help to avoid regulations on repatriating a large amount of dollars, right, that they want to then convert into digital currency, whatever, right? which the U.S. had enacted, stiffer regulations on repatriating money to try to go after money laundering and such. And, Salinas wanted to get around that, apparently, right? So it's another nail in the coffin with Salinas Pliego. And it's to be noted as well that, he's not doing very well in the U.S. anyway. TV Azteca in the U.S. has creditors nipping at his heels, and they've tried to trigger an involuntary bankruptcy case against TV Azteca to try to get the money back that they're owed, right? So all of this on top of, as we've mentioned, the 60 billion pesos he owes in back taxes that he's refusing to pay. So not good times for Don Ricardo.
And it kind of speaks to the way that, and similarly to the first story that we were looking at around María Amparo Cásar and her connections, her political connections, just the way that the people at the top, the people that are in the club, the way that they are willing to disrespect laws, engage in bribery, try to, keep from paying their taxes, et cetera, et cetera. It's quite interesting here, Sin embargo, publishes this article saying who is Executive One that's mentioned in this indictment, that is quite likely Luis Niño de Rivera, who unceremoniously stepped down. If you're familiar with that name, he has a rather famous daughter, Sofia Niño de Rivera, who is a comedian and very, very active on social media, but has been one of the fiercest critics, using her so-called comedy to attack the government of López Obrador. Right, kind of portraying yourself as an ordinary Mexican woman when it turns out she's daughter of this allegedly corrupt banker. Right, it kind of shows that this is that top percent, that top 0.1% of Mexican society that wants to protect its privilege. Right, that wants to continue living off the state, that wants to continue to engage in allegedly illegal actions in order to maintain that wealth, that privilege, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's quite an indictment of the political class in the United States and their connections with the bourgeoisie here in Mexico.
And not to mention, of course, the Democratic Party that went all out to protect Cuellar's seat against Jessica Cisneros, as you mentioned, by barely 300 votes. It's like a Bob Menendez case all over again.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right, and so moving on, we wanted to also talk about this story, which is this news that came out, and I think a lot of people jumped the gun on this story after a woman named Ceci Flores. She is someone who had her son forcibly disappeared. She is a madre buscadora. She's been searching for the remains, if he is in fact dead, of her son, trying to figure out what happened. I think she's very much positioned herself as one of the voices of these groups of mothers who obviously we should recognize are put in its terrible circumstance. I can't imagine the kind of pain of what it's like to not only lose your child, but to be in the circumstance of a enforced disappearance where you don't even know where they are. But unfortunately, what we're witnessing here in Mexico, and it's to my lament as somebody who is deeply committed to the defense and promotion of human rights, is this very curious instance of a sort of very awkward collaboration between certain human rights defenders and the political opposition in Mexico. So Ceci Flores comes to Mexico City on the invitation of other madres buscadoras, and then makes an extraordinary accusation that there is a secret clandestine crematorium in Mexico City. Now, that this happens to be revealed in this moment draws a lot of questions, because what it does is basically introduce this issue of enforced disappearances, which is a very serious crisis in this country, into the discussion during the election. And what I found very curious was the way that how quickly it was picked up. And so journalists, correspondents, writing for the English language press, but also those based here in Mexico, quickly said, how is it possible? Claudia Sheinbaum is seeking the presidency. Meanwhile, in the jurisdiction that she once governed, there are now clandestine crematoriums. And then it turns out that it's not the case at all. That, in fact, they did the investigations. Obviously, the investigators go to the site where this alleged crematorium was located. They pick up some of the remains, and it turns out they are of animal origin. And so that makes me wonder why was this brought up now, and why did it make so much noise? And unfortunately, I can't help but conclude that it was a politically driven affair. And unfortunately, and I say this with a lot of lament, because again, I'm not trying to criticize all human rights offenders. I'm not trying to pigeonhole this individual in particular. But, she comes out in defense of none other than María Amparo Cásar, making a very kind of clear signal to the public saying, I'm on this side. I'm not on this other side. I'm in favor. I'm defending, these political actors here in Mexico that are opposed to the government. We've seen it also with a lot of organizations that have historically done very important work in this country, but for one reason or another, have decided to take a very more adversarial with López Obrador than they ever were with Peña Nieto or Felipe Calderón or Vicente Fox, who perpetrated gross violations of human rights during.
And if you're going to be, if you're going to be adversarial, fine, be adversarial. But the problem here is jumping the gun because you have an axe to grind.
Yeah.
Right? Without, either investigating or simply waiting to see what the real story is before, coming out with these splashy headlines like the one we're seeing here from the AP, right?
Yeah. And in fact, I remember a journalist writing, is there going to be a response? What's Claudia Sheinbaum have to say? They found a crematorium where she was previously the jefa de gobierno, right? And the way that they try to exploit the obvious sympathy that people are going to have for las madres buscadoras, the mothers who are searching for their children, in order to advance a political agenda. And it actually, ultimately, and this is why it's so frustrating for me as someone who's committed to the defense and promotion of human rights, it undermines the defense and promotion of human rights. It politicizes something that shouldn't be partisan. It makes it so that it's become you versus me, when this is a commitment that we have to humanity.
Yeah.
And actually, ultimately, in the long run, affects our ability to advance in the issues of human rights.
Agreed. Yeah. And, this was a moment when, Sheinbaum was asked at the press conference, and, the poker face comes down and she gives, a very clear answer on this, right? Basically what I just said, right? They didn't, they didn't wait. They jumped the gun. Turns out they were canine remains.
Yep.
And now what are they saying, right? Because what you don't hear after the fact are, oh, I screwed up.
Yeah.
In very, very few cases, right? Very, very, oh, I screwed up. Jumped the gun, got this one wrong. Which can happen even, to the best of us. But not when you see, the way this particular case was used and the way Ceci Flores has acted subsequently, right? Even some of the Madres Buscadores have come out and said, had to put their distance with her. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, you overstepped the lines here, and for me it was really clear that there was an effort to kind of emotionally manipulate people, right? I'm just looking at this over now, and I'm reminded of the fact that they talked about she said, well, the worst part is that we found ID cards belonging to children, right? And it turns out that there were children there. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't obviously very serious cases of enforced disappearances, of human rights violations happening in this country. But this manipulation for political means is really lamentable. And
well, actually, they tracked down the two people whose ID cards they were, and those people are alive.
They're alive, exactly, right? And even the way that they kind of put the argument made by the prosecutor Ulises Lara, saying, right, in the scare quotes, saying that the bones were of animal origin, right? I mean, I'm not an expert on the subject, but it's the kind of thing that you can actually verify relatively quickly, right? You can figure out if these remains are of animal origin, of human origin, right? It's the kind of thing that can happen in a matter of hours, right? And in fact, Ceci Flores jumped on that and said, well, maybe they can tell me if the skull that I found belongs to my son, right? Again, an attempt, a deliberate attempt, an obvious attempt to manipulate people's sentiment for political ends. And I think that is to the detriment of all these people who are authentically searching for justice. And so while we're on the topic, moving on, of the coverage of issues throughout Mexico and Latin America more broadly, the Pulitzers came out, Kurt, The Pulitzer
Oh, really?
Prizes came out. Hooray!
Oh, boy.
Everybody pat themselves
Oh,
on the
boy.
back. Aren't we doing a great job? And believe it or not, the winner for international reporting was the New York Times for their coverage of Israel's genocide in Gaza.
Couldn't have been given to a worse outlet.
How disconnected are they? I mean, how out of touch could you possibly be? Right? Like, listen, we're journalists here. We understand there is a lot of prestige with being a Pulitzer Prize winner, right? It is, as Lopez Obrador
Well,
calls
there
it,
used
the
to
Nobel
be.
Prize in journalism.
There used to be.
There used to be. And I
Yeah.
think this, in a lot of ways, really is going to undermine that prestige. This, in particular, this case here. And I think this tweet that we're seeing on the screen here, I'll read it out to you, says it all, right? There's this headline written for The Intercept by Jeremy Scahill and Ryan Grimm, which says, leaked New York Times Gaza memo tells journalists to avoid words genocide, ethnic cleansing, and occupied territory. Amid the internal battle over the New York Times coverage of Israel's war, top editors headed down a set of directives. So, quite literally, the leadership of this outlet is telling its rank and file journalists, this is how you're going to report on this issue because we have a political interest in defending the Zionist entity and its genocidal campaign. So don't use these words, and they're rewarded with a Pulitzer Prize in international reporting.
Well, even worse was the case with Anat Schwartz there, all right, who was, with no experience whatsoever, was hired to, publish outright falsehoods, right, with a family member there, right, who was covering the culinary beat beforehand, right, and not to mention the coverage of Mexico that we've covered amply on this program and in other places. Right? And so, what do you see? You see a declining power trying to paper over the decline with awards. And it's what we've said a lot here anyway, right? Elite journalists in the U.S. fail upwards. They never face any consequences for their bad journalism. On the contrary, they get awards. So there's never any reason for them to improve, right? The New York Times coverage of Mexico has not improved, right? Going from Maria Habib to Natalie Kitcherev, because there was no reason for them to. Right? There was no reason for them to. And it won't get, Asa Mamad before. No reason for them to. Right? They'll just fail upwards. They'll move on. Their time in Mexico will just be a chapter in their memoirs, right? And now they're participating in the Pulitzer, and maybe they'll get their individual Pulitzers later on. Right?
I'm sure of it. Yep.
And, a lot of people, and, of course, there was huge blowback on this in social media yesterday, and a lot of people in Mexico that I was seeing were making the very immediate comparison to the Nobel Peace Prize with Obama.
Right? Yeah.
People aren't fooled by these awards anymore, these big shiny awards, right? Which only then, remove their own prestige.
And on the topic, that brings us to our final segment, as always, our bad story of the week. This time from The Economist, reading, Andrés Manuel López Obrador will haunt his successor. Mexico's next president will struggle against gangs, poverty, and migration.
He
Now,
will be
you
the
would think
ghost
that
of National Palace.
I've just, as I read this story, I had to think, these people aren't even creative anymore. They're not even trying. It just feels like the same story I've read a dozen times before. It's the same kind of rehashed argument that he's a larger-than-life figure and his hand-chosen successor, and that, he looms over the next presidency, right, et cetera, right? I find the point, for example, in this point here, at least they admit that Sheinbaum is looking like she's going to win. At least they're willing to finally admit that the polls are unlikely to change anytime soon and that the election is likely going to confirm what they've been saying all along. But, these comments about the economy is growing at a sluggish 2 to 3% per year, failing to attract sufficient investment, poverty has fallen.
How's the UK economy growing? How's the UK economy growing, by the way?
Yeah. Is it growing at all? I think Even mentioning when it does talk about the drop in poverty, it says, but a third of Mexicans remain poor. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, there's still a long way to go, but it's certainly a lot further than it was under the previous regime. And even this one, they love to mention this one, 40% lack health care, which is actually, as we've analyzed before, a deliberate misreading of that data.
Absolutely.
What it actually is, are people aware of the healthcare services that are available to them? And there was a mistake made around Insabi about people feeling confident about whether or not they had access to those services. That's why that number is. But in fact, access to healthcare has improved. I've talked about it on this program previously. My experiences with the public system, because I'm a working class guy, I don't have private insurance, has been extraordinary. The attention that we received was top notch, without any kind of corruption or need to buy supplies, as is often the case in many underfunded public systems, et cetera, right? It's just kind of the same story all over again.
And so just to give a little context here, The Economist has been one of the most hysterical outlets against Mexico in the fourth transformation over these past 5 years. I think they really clearly have energy interests here because they're really, particularly, upset about the energy issue, both The Economist and the Financial Times, right? And just to give a little history, right? This is the same Economist that loved Peña Nieto when he was passing the energy counter reform in 2013, 2014. They published that, that big cover, the Rise of Mexico with the big sombrero flying in the air, right? Didn't turn out exactly the way they predicted, right? And one of the ways they've punished López Obrador for attempting to, reassert public control of the energy sector, among other things, is to drop Mexico in their democracy index down to the level of a hybrid regime, right? Together with Bolivia and other non-well-behaved Latin American countries. And actually one of the most amusing Economist moments of the past 2 years is when their correspondent here in Mexico, Sarah Burke, retweeted a doctored video from Van Pipe. Remember that one, Jose Luis? Of Hugo López Gatell, right? Saying this is the worst thing I've ever heard a government official say ever. Van Pipe is a right wing who makes supposedly funny videos here in Mexico. Yeah. So Sarah Burke didn't even take the time. To see who Van Pipe was. It even says right in his account, if I publish a video, it's because it's edited. So this is The Economist for you. So if you want to go back up just to the top here.
Yeah.
Just some of this. We've talked about kind of grandiloquent language in this episode. I think it's been like the theme of today's episode, right? Restoring the health of the republic and whatever else. Just a little bit farther up. Oh, yeah. So The Economist has its own kind of doomsday language. Look at this. The scourge of the blockbuster remake. The scourge. It's like, come on. The scourge of the blockbuster remake. Right? And then if we kind of scroll down a little bit, The Economist just can't understand why, Morena is popular here, right? So of course it has to try to spin everything in its favor, as you mentioned, right? Just go down just a little bit more, if you could. So it then talks about that these issues are not at the front of the campaign, demonstrates the power of López Obrador. And it says there in the middle of the paragraph, the current president has many Mexicans in thrall. Remember Andrea Navarro in the Bloomberg silliness of last week, right? These dumb Mexicans are just enthralled to López Obrador. They're enthralled to him. They believe, I'm quoting right here, they believe whatever the evidence against, right? Whatever the evidence against, that he has transformed their country into a safer, more prosperous, and less corrupt place. Actually, it is. It is safer. The statistics bear that out. It's got a long way to go, but it is safer. It is more prosperous, right? I know they don't like it. And it is less corrupt, right? a view enhanced by his generous cash transfers to the poor, which leads to the next paragraph that 64% of the people who receive cash transfers say they're going to vote for Sheinbaum because they're bought off. Again,
Of course.
yawn.
Yeah.
Yawn. Right? As you say, this is just really, really tired, isn't it, Jose Luis? It's just, and if we go down a little bit farther, right, it talks about how, Xochitl Galvez isn't making her mark because of the, the history of the PRI behind it, right? And then just, if we want to keep going here down towards the end, AMLO loves dirty energy.
Mm-hmm.
The real thing was that multinationals can't abuse the electrical grid like they did before. And then they come out with one of the most spectacular lies of the piece. And this is right at the end, right? Although they look set to support her as president, voters are likely to limit Morena's seats in Congress, is what it says. This is the very, very last paragraph, right? Concerned about the degradation of Mexico's democracy under López Obrador. According to all polls, Morena is going to hold its majority in Congress. It's going to hold its majority in Congress, right? And then it comes out with the spectacular lie that in the 2021 midterms, voters stripped Morena's coalition of the two-thirds majority needed for constitutional changes, something they never had. So this is what we've talked about before. It's not just a question of spinning things to their, to their line, like they did above with talking about corruption and violence and such. But when necessary, they simply lie. They simply lie. As if voters are going to, return a divided Congress, which no one is predicting. And if they're going to do what they did in the 2021 midterms, which didn't even happen.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't even happen. Do they not even look this up? Do they willingly propagate lies? Right? And then we get to the final paragraph where it says María Ibarra of the Expansión says women are not excited about the country getting its first female president. Oh, really? Really? Have you gone out and really done some work to see if that's true? Or are you just listening to one person out of 65 million women in Mexico? And who is this one person? We'll find out in a second. Go ahead, Jose Luis.
It's just so cynical, right? Like, it's going to be the first woman elected to lead a country in North America. Not Canada, not the United States, but Mexico. And a woman belonging to a religious minority of Jewish descent. It's extraordinary that they would try to downplay the significance of that. Of course it's significant. Of course it means something to women. Have they talked to any other women who isn't María Ibarra? Because if they did, they would find that, of course, there is a lot of enthusiasm about that. And I think in terms of what it means for women in politics at a global level, I think is also quite significant, right? There's been a lot of work done to make sure that the historical exclusion of women begins to be eroded away. And to be at the doorstep of the election of the first female president of Mexico, the first in all of North America, and to underplay it, I think is quite disappointing, quite cynical.
It is cynical. So what you see here is just a leader editorial which tries to twist and spin things to its favor, when necessary lies, and then just plucks out a quote from one person in an attempt to, prove the point that it wanted to prove beforehand. If anyone was curious as to who María Ibarra is, right? María Ibarra, before expansion, was at Mexico's most conservative paper, Reforma, right? And has also participated in journalism workshops at the CIDE. And look, Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity. María Amparo Cásar's organization funded by US aid, right? Amongst other things, MCCAI has had the gall to conduct workshops on how to carry out investigative journalism.
Yeah.
And María Ibarra was all in there, so is the perfect person for The Economist to use to reinforce the point that they wanted to make anyway.
So there you have it. Another episode of Soberanía, the Mexican Politics Podcast, bringing you news and analysis about Mexico, especially in light of the upcoming election. As always, been a pleasure discussing these topics with you, Kurt. And make sure to like and subscribe. And if you can, tell your friends. I think that's one of the things. We did a brief presentation just yesterday, Kurt and I. And one of the things we wanted to stress with the public is that, we engage in this criticism, and I think it feels good to do it. But also, I think it's important for us to support initiatives like this, like the Soberanía podcast, the Mexican Solidarity Media website, the publishing that Kurt does over at Jacobin around Mexico, because, if you're convinced that these voices that are used to telling you these lies about the country aren't worthy of being listened to anymore, then I think it's important to support initiatives like this that are trying to get the real truth out there. And I got a forthcoming story today, coming out today with Truth Out about the encampment of students in solidarity with Palestine that's happening here at the Autonomous University of Mexico. So be on the lookout for that. And of course, as always, Kurt's writing in Jacobin.
Yeah, I've got a piece coming out very soon as well about the Ecuador situation, which you talked about previously. I totally agree with what José Luis said and echo it, support genuinely independent journalism. And we'll be back next week with another episode of Soberanía.
We'll see you next time.